Hi everyone, Jodey with the Ring Lord here. Welcome to our new Ring Shorts series. These will be short videos, usually around 5 minutes or less, that we use to share info about the Ring Lord, how we do things, and some other bits of information we'd like to share with you. This video is about how we measure our rings here at the Ring Lord. Take a look at this graphic on the screen. I'll be giving more info about it during the video. And when you're ready to purchase your rings, refer back to the screen grab on the graphic. It's from our website and it shows you where all the info you will need can be found. When you purchase rings from any manufacturer, there are two measurements you need, the wire diameter and the inner diameter. We're going to talk about wire diameter first. Any material that is 19 gauge and thicker, that's 1 millimeter wire diameter and thicker, is measured in SWG or standard wire gauge. Any material that is 20 gauge and thinner, which is 0.81 millimeter wire diameter and thinner, is measured in AWG or American wire gauge. The lower the number, the thicker the wire. For example, 19 gauge is 1 millimeter wire and 14 gauge is 2 millimeter wire. It's important to understand the difference between SWG and AWG because using the wrong wire gauge will affect the outcome of your project. For example, if your tutorial calls for 16 gauge SWG 5/16 internal diameter, which is 1.6 millimeter wire, and you use 16 gauge 5/16 ID AWG, which is 1.2 millimeter wire, your project will either be very loose or it won't work at all. I've prepared a visual representation of the different wire gauges. Let's look at the chart here on the table. I've got an example of an 18 gauge SWG ring here and an 18 gauge AWG ring here. 18 gauge SWG wire is 1.2 millimeters in diameter, while the 18 gauge AWG wire is 1 millimeter in diameter. It's a small difference, but it can make a huge difference in your project. If we look further down, we see that 18 gauge AWG 1 millimeter wire is the same as 19 gauge SWG 1 millimeter wire. Now let's look at the 18 gauge SWG compared to 16 gauge AWG. They are the same wire diameter of 1.2 millimeters, but they're called different names depending on the wire gauge system you're using. Let's look at one more example. 16 gauge AWG 3/8 inch ID compared to 16 gauge SWG 3/8 inch ID. These are the same inner diameter, but you can clearly see that the SWG ring is much thicker than the AWG ring because SWG is 1.6 millimeter wire and AWG is 1.2 millimeters. Now we'll talk about the inner diameter. We sell in fractional inches, so on our website you'll see 16 gauge 1/4 inch or 18 gauge 5/32 ID. The 18 gauge part is the wire diameter we talked about earlier. The 5/32 of an inch part is the inner diameter of the ring. When you look at our website, you'll see the wire diameter given in gauge, like 14 gauge, the comparable millimeters, which would be 2 for 14 gauge, and the comparable decimal inches, which is 0.08 inches. For the inner diameter, we give the measurements in 3 ways. Fractional inches, that would be the 5/32 part, decimal inches, which would be 0.165, and the comparable millimeters, which would be 4.19. Some tutorials or projects are written using fractional inches for the ID, and some use millimeters. If your project calls for millimeters, for most weaves you will be fine using the closest ring size in millimeters we sell on the website. For example, if you're making European Form 1 and the tutorial calls for a 6 millimeter ID ring, our 18 gauge 7/32, which is 5.7 millimeters, will work fine. If you're making a picky weave like JPL or Captive Zen, you will need to test your rings. And if you're making a design from somebody, you will need to check with your author and see if they can suggest rings or if the fractional inch rings will work. I've put a chart of AWG to SWG conversions in the description box below. Make sure that you hit that subscribe button so you get all our new content. And if you have any questions about how we measure our rings, email us at projecthelp@TheRingLord.com. If you have questions about your order or need product help, email customer service directly at orders@TheRingLord.com. Have a great day.